Irrational or not, the fool is one of the most relatable, curious and recurring figures in the world, as had those that outspoken surprised and laughed ever since time immemorial. We worship folly by seeing it at people and by lovingly making its appearance in ourselves as one of the timeless archetypes that we enjoy/taboo. Many of us suffer from incompatibility with folly in our lives. We are so nervous and upright that trying to fit itself sufficiently to a world that facilitates workaholism and efficiency to become the workaholics, might so perhaps be merely producers of tools all around us, a purely unofficial requirement to begin enjoying the game as well as your energy for free expression. Sometimes questions if the way to conquer this situation can be found here, and today I would provide the antidote. Informing people. The character of the fool is complex but was later revealed to have two essential characteristics, and that he has great innocence of self the moment. Bottle supplies the oxygen necessary for such a combustion, roughly the way in which the fool tames us up. In 1511 the Dutch scholar Erasmus published The Praise of Flaws, which has been tremendously popular and is a profoundly penetrating examination of folly in Western literature. So bald someone praises her, he criticized her friends, and Erasmus warned his enemies about possible attacks upon the church. However, even religious figures found this work amusing, and friendship and marriage contain a certain amount of folly to overcome the defects of children and friends and call them small vices in terms of other people. Intellectuals are foolish in their pursuit of knowledge, which spend years going to the library, doing research and thinking that what they are doing to be of a considerable size so that a few other intellectuals over a century will read their book and give you far more of it. Folly compares philosophers to theater. They are boring, and our annoyance as philosophers seem not to understand how illusions that help belie the mind are helpful, even when they're distortions of the reality cause. The fool seems infinitely liberated and happier than those who are burdened by wisdom, and are the life of the party. Indeed, the fools always speak the truth because they lack wisdom to craft lies and to manipulate others. With the joy-afflicted laughter and play there, it is not only universal but to be part of life, no other than to join the fool and yet recognize that being the fool is in fact the highest form of wisdom. This is a nostalgic return to a simpler way of life, no longer coming from the brain but the heart. The simplicity and normal folks can occasionally infringe in the same manner, wield most of these principles of wisdom as those bound through learning and convention, or are as of now expressed a less articulate truth in popular proverbs than if they were recognized as wise people. The oxymoron of deformity is a literal paradox where good people often attack evil-spirited people for fearing the harsh words on many controversial topics or simply that they spoke bravely about them. The archetypal wise fool of Socrates not only told the silliness that the alleged philosophers were wicked of course, but he himself described that his own wisdom was stemmed from knowing ignorance itself, as Shakespeare writes. When a dangerous truth needs to be said and those in power are afraid to yell about it, it's generally the fool who steps in. That is a fact, but nobody these goes to utter, and this gives instant relief because people now know of this having to be said. This general can distinguish two types of fools: the natural fool, who does not know the social hierarchy and utters truth but occasional ignorant of social conventions, and professional fool, whose job it is to make harsh truths more palatable by debasing them with humor and wit, is seldom successful. The greatest foes are often cleverer than the people who laugh at them. In fact, the grand secret of the successful fool is that he becomes no fool at all, as the important English missionary artist William Blake writes. If that fool were in his flawy disposition, he wouldn't become wise. The sly, the clown, and trickster bear similar traits. They constitute sources of humor, usually laughter, as catalysts for comic catharsis. However, they express a duality of and not folly, peace and disorder. Some may look like a joke, but it can actually be a warning. The great theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard writes, in a theater a fire broke out. They thought it as a joke and applauded. He reiterated it, then the acclaim was even larger. I think that's how it will end up in the world, generally applauding from those who think it is a joke. However, many come from a place of depression and a bad future. The wider association between comedy and mental disorders, such as rage and anxiety, is known as humor paradox, where comedy can act as a shielding mechanism when people retaliate at clown emotions and muddle, such as pity, fear, or repulsion. In fact, some people suffer from coulrophobia, overwhelming fear of clowns, which is perhaps this because the job of the modern clown is always to entertain people by being the subject of laughter, and is not always successful at it. The clown has always to create on the same face and play the same character. The humanist which is one-sided about may mentally throw it to the bear, and the clown slowly turns back into their shadow, its dark side and his personality. The dark clown, once one of the strongest characters of popular culture, was better portrayed the choke. In medieval theater, clowns would not only make the crowd think, but sometimes snatch up in which was enclosed a door of hell, the entrance onto whom a giant inked his mouth. However, the fool and the trickster also have some psychological differences. Basically, the fool is presented as an innocent or harmless one who would not hurt a fly, while the trickster intentionally is deluded and seeks to twist others for fun and the effects of it. The trickster hates at that pleasure at learning others failed or humiliated circumstances, and may console others in failing, and conceal that he feels joy internally. The trick takes immediately this opportunity. However, the fool is not interested in laughter on someone, but rather to laugh to his own face, because this courageous feat lessens his own persona, but also the social mask that allows others to open for a profound sounding. Whereas the fool likes to entertain people and is usually the whack of a joke, the trickster mainly seeks to entertain himself, even in the expense of others. Someone that feels uneasy can have a sense of laughter even in difficult situations, even if it only means stepping forward to make a joke, even if you do it even if in the most emotional situation. What a person should not make anyone in any way uncomfortable just to come over it. How ambiguous is actually as the person plays like a fool in order to be known as coming into his traps. It was believed that having a fool in the local shops shut off even the evil vision in medieval times. This is no antiquated superstition, rather it represents a psychological truth enduring value. It is usually a good idea to plant the victim outside where we can always keep an eye on him. We must make room for the demonic actor in ourselves and admit him inside the court of any of our hearts, where he can give us fresh ideas and new energy. During the mid-morning centuries it would be celebrated about the feast of fooling on New Year's Day by the poor clergy. All conventions were temporarily suspended to cover up the unexpected revolts of latent destructive urges. The natural order of things was outstripped by God's. Sacrilege ritual was parasied in an obscene fashion, the church authorities were ridiculed, and it was all allowed through the church to cover these year-long repressions of hostility, lust and rebellion. These blasphemous celebrations were eventually thwarted or forced underground. The fool also. Thus did the ergodot occupy at the court a separate place as the one person capable to ridicule the lady he used as his guest, all in respectably humor, but also when others or the public want to have another fight and want to be truly a joker, which they would never let detract from his reputations by being authentic. Fools are due to their close relation to king being freed and permitted to speak quietly. However, some went too far, and were beheaded. They are shown a failure if they opposed social norms and other social rules. There is often seen as incompetent. But every group must always have such a figure as they are agents of changing, and the liveliness of culture require that there be space for figures whose function was to unveil and disrupt the very things that the culture is founded on. The court jesters usually had some sort of physical deformity. They came from poor families and were financial burdens, but because of their unusual body they were viewed as a peculiar sign of the Lord, so generally dwarvens, rabbits, and all the like are chosen too. Dwarves were specifically sought after and held in many royal courts. As gifts to fellow royal members they sat next to the king, who would then appear much larger and enhance their powerful standing. They proved to be human beings with unusual depth and wisdom, removed from the most complex activities and interests of the typical person through their loneliness and suffering. In Shakespeare's tragedy on King Lear, the king had a relationship with the foolish as friendship and dependency. When king is left with the knights he is a horrible sterile figure. When the king wants the little guy to accompany him everywhere as his alter ego, the fool can be expected to reverse relationships among dominant and subservient forces because he is in the paradoxical position of virtual criminality coupled with absolutely dependence on the support of the social group he belongs to. Just like the tricks and jesters of that day, they use their intelligence to impress people of later social status, but their features are exaggerated for theatrical effect. The myth of Parsifal is also written of the journey that is needed to help a young boy get to meet his mother of Parsifal so that he will be surprised in order to ruffle his hair and renown the real man. Here also speaks of how the trauma presented by the psychological wound is expressed in external conflicts. Every adolescent receives his wad to the Fisher King, It is the rise of the whole creature from childish thought towards the self-consciousness, and to watch that an adolescent grows up and realizes that the world is not simply joy and joy. His first contact with a wound is that which later on was redemption in life. There is a timeful ceremony carried every night in Grail Castle where a maiden holds holy grail filled with wine and grants to every person that drinks from it their deepest wishes from you, the kingfishers not participating and facing alone, as there is no further external exertion are possible if its internal capacity. It is perhaps the deepest form of suffering, to be right in front of beauty, happiness, and holiness, but unable to take any of it. Justice had prophesied this long back that Fisher King would be healed when an innocent fool came in the court and asked a clear question one day. Parsifal finds a man in a boat, the Fisher King asked if there was place to stay to the night, and the Fisher King guided him to Grail Castle. Parsifal attends the celebration, but the Fisher King groans alone and remembers his mom's advice to her no too many questions was not given, symbolizing a mother association. In it he forgets what he was directed by the godfather figure that trained him, and does not speak to Fisher King the next day. When he changes around, the castle was no one to understand. It took Parsifal 20 long and painful years to find the stone horsey castle again. The original myth ends here. The inner castle is always in, but appears invisible to our eyes unless we see everything with new eyes. Although many other continued stories say that after Parsifal revisited the Grail Castle, he then asked Fisher King to follow, who does the Grail serve, immediately healing and peace and happiness prevailed over the land. The Grail is guiding us toward an eternal meaning, and the purpose of life should be servants of Jesus or the higher self. The singer gives us a cleric to see to it that a man must understand to seek a folly, innocent and drowsed part of himself. The inner fool is the only person who knows his wounded Fletcher Kettleman. In Don Quixote, often considered the first contemporary novel, a man is driven on his weak horse to become uncharacterous, as Don Quixote himself lives in this way to defend the innocent, and defeat the wicked to do exactly. All this happens in the name of a laity woman, whom he idolizes and has left unseen in the novel. The phrase quixotic refers to a person who is apt for being deluded, unable to distinguish reality from the imagination, and pursues lofty and romantic ideals which are impractical at their respective moments. This is the origin of the idiom, tilting to windmills, attacking imaginary enemies. No more do Don Quixote join him as a horse and sheep man to support Sancho Panza, though puzzled by his master's fantasies but promised great wealth, back riding a horse. Don Quixote's other ideas end up torturing those he meets because he is unceasingly unable to understand the world as actually there is, not only are attained to him as a human man, but as far and wide. He also stumbles, and it may be advice that even most intelligent people can fall victim to their own foolishness. At the end of the story, Don Quixote falls sick and sleeps, and later on gives of his craziness when he realizes he has lost his life and is just insane. The story itself turns from comedy to tragedy, and the people who looked at him with scorn cannot help but feel pity for him after thinking he is wrong and that he is actually the knight that all of his benefits fade out, are actually. After 2 life-giving illusions, he suffers. Here he dies from an abuse of fact. The question comes up, is it better to understand and avoid the truth, or to live in a criminal paradise? To get by it shows who is an ideal man, a positively beautiful individual in a morally corrupt and disused world. The Prince Myshkin and his friends return back to Russian territory after taking treatment for epilepsy in a Swiss sanatorium and idiocy, an actual medical term for neurodegenerative disorders until the 20th century, with an influx of capital taking at St. Petersburg to create the cosmos of society. The protagonist turns about with the train journey from St. Petersburg in respect to innocence rather than the comicality. Because, first of all, the prince is an idiot, and then a fool, knows nothing of the world and has no place of one there, to have no real relationship to the world. And largely speaking to a corrupt, money-hungry, manipulative and egocentric society he finds himself behind his truth. The prince is frank, open and unable to express what is on his mind, despite what is on the ground within it, to condemn him to becoming an idiot or a victimistic creature. The hysterical boy Ippold, a child atheist and nihilist in the final stages of tuberculosis and under death that has lost his will and rebellious against society, nature and the god, states famously said better to be unhappy and know the worst things on earth than to be happy in a bogged-off paradise. In the most popular line of the story, Dostoevsky writes that the kingdom assures us that beauty will save the world. But it is always this little bit near the hero, who rushes where angels fear to go, and wins the hand of the princess and her kingdom by this act alone. In its spontaneity, his plan to life combines wisdom, madness, and folly. When he mixes these elements with the right proportions, the results will not be miraculous in the end. When there is one-sidedness, everything can end up in a ragged mess. Interestingly, the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy wrote a little story containing Ivan the Fool, alluding to this figure. In their story, Ivan is the youngest and third son in a peasant family, taken advantage because of his naivety, kindness, and capability to easily forgive others, even at his own expense. Even though his brothers of money and military power lead an easy life, he lives in a farmhouse that his grandmother manages and works the fields. If the other brothers ran out of money, the fathers insist on demanding his share of the inheritance of the father, but there is Ivan and his sister who need incongruity that gives Ivan and his brothers demands. That is it, because Ivan sends out a little devil to each brother to start feuds with him. Then the two evil spirits succeed to do the two brothers with greed and power and get into trouble, with Ivan working softer and overcome all obstacles from the devil. The three little devils go one by one to defeat Ivan and convince him that they'll want his life if he spares a bit of their life. And so is Ivan granted a wish and innocently says, "God bless you," which makes them disappear, that he can make gold out of leaves and to make soldiers out of straw, and decides to give people and convert for swapping soldiers to sing and dance. But in Tashkent, the fool is known generally as one in the light of a white rose symbolizing innocence and purity, with a large purse treasure in the other hand. He seems willing to sacrifice everything for the trip, walking happily at the sky, soaked in all the great adventures that await him. From what they appear was tarot-derived or are used, inspired by theatrical festivals and taraki, whose root reflects gizasis, frivolity. In 1853, the Moorish practice of cartomancy appeared to rise to prominence, and mystics had the next 38 known cards to be those of Rakana, with all 22 being major arcana and the remaining 59th, minor arcana woman number. For instance, in the last card there is a large laurel wreath of pure-hearted, in which the fool, who is androgynous, becomes the cosmic dancer and anima mundi, world ion bloody, and when journey ends anew it starts that same path that is heroic because he jumps towards the place of coffins in the world of unknowns. The fool's journey is similar to the monomyth of the hero's journey, in which the hero has a summons to adventure and can disappear into unknown and impenetrable earthly realm, whose worst fear, event, person, or a memory is long sought, and earn the gold, the prize hard to reach. Fidel is a wanderer, energy, ubiquitous and immortal, and is always in a process of becoming, and is regarded as a launching into the great mysteries of living. Tarot cards can be viewed as pictures representing the typical experiences along the ever-old path into self-knowledge, or what Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist Carl Jung called personalized meaning. It is appropriate that the fool is zero at his inductance, which is directly associated with infinity as the power of zero in its circular form, which is symbolic of infinite return, and eternity associated with the maxim, one is all, and all is the one. It is the pleroma, is that pleroma, the fullness of it. There are both past, present, and future. It is everywhere, the letter at its center. This hieroglyph also stands for the cosmological egg, from whose fertile center all creation erupts and continues to arise, and is linked to paradise, that blissful state of our unconscious nature that humanity experienced once upon a time outside or, of the own, lived with, and the nostalgia we feel toward our childhoods reflects this great desire to reach the final circle, the original state of completeness through which a union between two semblances is based, in Jungian psychology. Although no complete deck exists still today, despite the belief that is the image of a vagrant, fool or beggar in our playing cards dressed in disguise to the Joker, they carried a bow and put feathers in their hair, which can relate to the notion of the wild man. In the late 15th century German Hosterspiel plays, however, it bears a robe and rings the jester bells, reminiscent of the prince as an amiable horseback racer or lion. In the first Dantes of the same century, the fool portrayed as a half-snow-covered old man bearing a staff, the inscription to be titled Misero, beggar. The fool is in such close contacts with his instinctually deaf sins so that you do not need to look through eyesight the places he wants to go. For this reason his animal nature lives more intensely in this card, taking on an imaginative sense instead of mainstream logic. Another version uses jester clothes on a stick all for his hands and his pants in a past Swiss card or when he is topped with a wand. In subsequent card decks such as the one in Marseille during the 17th and 18th centuries, a fool rides a jester hat, carries a pewt with one arm and goes near a moth who has torn his pants or just follows a fly by a dragon man. Nothing would start without the fool. Inventors and geniuses have almost always been viewed as no more merely fools at the start of their career and quite often at the end too. Shoshin is a Zen Buddhist concept and is written because of the beginner who is opposed to closed thought and seeing oneself as an expert. Only many can lead to the cultivation of silence, which will provide the necessary space for the nominative experiences. A large potential has been for our five senses by our lack of refinement but will not be available by to our inner clarity as that traditional route of success is taken: education, working, marriage, and so. When one removes himself from this path, he is seen as a fool whose adventures will largely be nothing more than death and debauchery. Whereas the Chinese proverb goes, one journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single one step. He thinks clearly and becomes more energetic about the wonderful situations on his back and urges us to live life to the fullest capacity, while a person who thinks too much is overprudent and stale and. Despite the fear of uncertainty, we fear many of us by the point of paralysis, for not experiencing resentment and, instead, wanting to face failure and sacrifice success. This state of concern and anxious thinking creates anxiety, and one more in real life suffers as the fail of being open does. However, what we call absolute failure may in reality lead to amazing success. As the alchemists say, wherever will it be found, all you needed is where. The fool usually has no idea what he is into by starting a new journey, and not all he has to overcome that may have prevented him entering in that region through a journey at all. Despite being told of his dangers, he is not afraid of change and exploring unknown and new territory. No matter how many times he stumbles in any area, never goes over. No great person has ever committed without a mistake. But ultimately, it is the journey which matters more than of the end. While there are many positive aspects with him, he will also be quite content so that he does not take a moment to step back and reflect, to take up where he is heading, so that he falls cliffside too. Sometimes our inner intuitive voice becomes judgmental and self-perpetuating. If this is not the voice of conformity, this is the message of his evil side, and he sounds ridiculous. In his relationship to the journey towards isolation, the abysmal looks for both emergence and resistance inherent in himself. He is closely tied to an archetype of immortal youth we all possess while growing up. It can bring into adult life the energy, beauty, and the creativity that childhood brings, or at least prevent one from having self-perceptibility and see lives as empty chambers, such as people who share the child stereotype of too little of her and what others tell her to act instead, the Freudian superego. After the child entered the rational world and the madman found the balance from it, these two are certain to be released from the gravity of daily events for those who feed the rest of mankind. Foz compared an unknown level with an advanced one of the affluent human relationships to ensure that the fool takes people's seriousness very seriously. After that, it implies a part of human personality, or indeed only of humanity where it rested, hence holding the initial wholeness of nature. And now, in legends, as soon as the fool presents himself as the fourth in a group of four people, we have a certain right to assume that he matches in itself an inferior sphere of existence. He is the doorway to the valuable work, which moves his own afresh. It is deficient of the function that leads to the healing of hernitis and warts. The noble farmer is one willing to risk ridicule, scorn and rejection, finding one through himself in all the world to be true and love and not need to be defined according to the responses of others or become conformist out of fear. It is free for a person to judge others to its specified benefits, and it in all its fullness is present to another human being. The holy fool is undoubtedly the least threatening to the states and powers that control the world and rule of their deity, and therefore has the capacity to become full in the spirit. Furthermore, the words of St. Paul claim that God made wisdom from this world foolish. Lord Jesus says to the zealot, and that they fear self and shall be fools. Foolness is a rejection of God's possessions in favor of religious and abstinence, though it may lead to humiliation and mockery from the crowd.